The cattle truck rolled to a stop in a cloud of New Mexico dust, and through the slats of the prison transport, Hauptmann Klaus Weber saw something that made no sense. A man on horseback, not a soldier, not a guard with a rifle and a stern expression. A cowboy, broad-brimmed hat pulled low, leather chaps worn smooth, a lasso coiled at his saddle like it belonged there. The horse beneath him was a paint, patches of brown and white catching the late afternoon sun, and the man sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, watching the convoy with the calm curiosity of someone observing weather patterns. Klaus pressed his face closer to the gap between the wooden slats. Behind him, the other prisoners, 23 German soldiers who'd surrendered in North Africa 6 months ago, stirred with the same confused interest. They'd spent weeks on ships, then trains, then finally these cattle trucks, moving deeper into a country that felt less like enemy territory and more like the moon. Empty, endless, strange. "Is that what I think it is?" whispered Lieutenant Friedrich Braun, craning his neck to see past Klaus's shoulder. "A cowboy," Klaus said quietly, almost to himself. "A real one." The truck doors swung open with a metallic clang, and an American sergeant, thick-necked, sunburned, clipboard in hand, barked something in English. Klaus understood enough. Get out. Line up. Shut up. Standard procedure. But as they climbed down into the dust, blinking against the light, Klaus couldn't stop looking at the landscape. Mesas stretched toward the horizon like broken teeth. Sagebrush dotted the red earth. The sky was so blue it hurt. And there, beyond the barbed wire fence that marked the boundary of Camp Lordsburg, were more of them. Cowboys, 5 or 6, maybe more, working a herd of cattle through a narrow canyon pass. The sound of their whistles and calls carried on the wind, strange and musical. One of them, a younger man, maybe 20, wheeled his horse around with such casual grace that it looked like dancing. "Mein Gott," breathed Otto Schneider, a farm boy from Bavaria who'd never seen anything bigger than a milk cow before the war. "Look at the size of those animals." The cattle were longhorns, their curved horns spanning wider than a man's outstretched arms. They moved like a single organism, flowing across the landscape, and the cowboys moved with them. Not driving them, exactly, but guiding them, reading them, responding to shifts in the herd's mood with subtle adjustments of position and voice. The American sergeant noticed their distraction and grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Welcome to the Wild West, boys," he said in heavily accented German. "You're gonna be working with those fellas. Hope you know how to ride." Klaus felt something twist in his chest. Working with cowboys? He'd expected labor, digging ditches, picking crops, the kind of punishment work that prisoners received. But this was something else entirely. They marched through the gates of Camp Lordsburg, past rows of tar paper barracks and a guard tower that looked newer than everything else. The camp was still being built, Klaus realized. Fresh lumber, wet paint. The Americans had thrown this together in a hurry, probably because they were running out of places to put prisoners. The Afrika Korps had surrendered in waves, and now here they were, in the middle of nowhere, staring at a world that looked like it had been pulled from a Karl May novel. That night, in the barracks, the men couldn't stop talking about it. "Cowboys," Friedrich kept saying, shaking his head. "Actual cowboys, like in the films." "My son has a toy cowboy," said Werner Hoffmann, an older man with gray at his temples and a photograph of his family that he kept folded in his pocket. "I sent it to him from Paris. Before Africa. I never thought—" He stopped, laughing softly. "I never thought I'd meet a real one." Klaus sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. They were engineers' hands, precise, careful, used to drafting plans and calculating load-bearing weights. He designed bridges in Poland, fortifications in Tunisia. He knew nothing about cattle or horses or the strange open land that surrounded them. But something about that cowboy on the paint horse had stirred something in him. The man looked free. Not in the political sense. Klaus knew he was still on American soil, still technically on the side of the enemy, but free in a deeper way. Like he belonged to the land instead of the other way around. "Tomorrow we find out what they want from us," Otto said, lying back on his bunk. "Maybe they need us to build something. Fences, maybe. Or maybe they just want to watch us try to ride horses, Friedrich joked. Entertainment for the locals. But Klaus didn't think it was a joke. The look in that cowboy's eyes hadn't been mocking. It had been assessed, measuring, like he was looking at men and trying to figure out what they were made of. The next morning, they were assembled in the yard just after dawn. The air was cool, the sun just beginning to paint the mesas gold. The same American sergeant stood before them, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was the cowboy from the paint horse. Up close, Klaus could see he was older than he'd first appeared. Maybe 50, with deep lines around his eyes and silver in his stubble. His hands were scarred and rough. His boots were worn down at the heels. "This here's Tom Garrett," the sergeant said. "He runs the WWII ranch about 8 miles west of here. You're going to be helping him and his crew with the cattle drive. 20,000 head moving north to the railroad. It's hard work. Long days. You do good, you get paid a little. You cause trouble, you're back to digging latrines." Understood. The prisoners nodded, still trying to process what they were hearing. Paid? For ranch work? Tom Garrett stepped forward, his eyes moving over them slowly. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "I don't care where you're from or what uniform you wore," he said in careful, deliberate English that Klaus could mostly follow. "Out here, what matters is whether you can work. Whether you can be trusted with an animal's life. Whether you've got the spine to stay in the saddle when things get rough." He paused. "We'll find out soon enough which of you do." The first week was humiliation dressed as education. Klaus had imagined himself competent. He'd survived combat, after all, had kept his men alive through sandstorms and artillery fire. But the horse beneath him had different opinions about his leadership abilities. The mare, a buckskin named Penny, had a way of stopping dead whenever Klaus gave an unclear signal, which was often. She'd turn her head and look at him with an expression that suggested deep disappointment. "She's smarter than you?" said one of the ranch hands. A young man named Jesse with a crooked smile and a rope always in his hands. "You gotta mean what you say. Horses know when you're bluffing." Klaus tried again, pressing his heels gently into Penny's sides the way Tom had shown him. This time she moved forward, but slowly, like she was doing him a favor. Behind him, Otto was having even worse luck. His horse, a tall roan gelding, had simply refused to leave the corral and was now standing with his head over the fence, ignoring Otto's increasingly desperate pleas. Friedrich, surprisingly, was a natural. He sat his horse like he'd been doing it his whole life, moving with the animal instead of against it. "It's like dancing," he said when Klaus asked him how he managed it. "You have to listen to your partner." The work itself was harder than Klaus had imagined. They started before dawn, when the desert air was cold enough to see your breath, and worked until the sun was a furnace overhead. They learned to move cattle from one pasture to another, to spot a sick animal in a herd of hundreds, to read the weather in the shape of clouds on the horizon. Tom and his crew, 6 men ranging from Jesse, barely 20, to old Jack, who claimed to be 70 but moved like a man 20 years younger, taught with a patience that surprised Klaus. "You're doing fine," Tom told him on the 3rd day, when Klaus had finally managed to cut a stray calf from the herd without causing a stampede. "Better than most new hands, honestly. You think too much, but that's fixable." They ate meals together, prisoners and cowboys alike, sitting on the ground or on fence rails, sharing canteens and passing around sandwiches that the ranch cook. A Mexican woman named Rosa, who ran the kitchen like a general, prepared each morning. The conversations were halting at first, limited by language and caution, but slowly they found common ground. Otto talked about his family's farm in Bavaria, and old Jack told stories about driving cattle through blizzards in Montana. Friedrich shared cigarettes he'd been issued at the camp, and Jesse showed them how to braid leather into functional art. Klaus found himself watching Tom Garrett constantly, trying to understand the man. Tom was quiet, economical with words, but when he spoke, everyone listened. He had a way of seeing problems before they became disasters, noticing a loose shoe on a horse, spotting a section of fence that would fail in the next storm, understanding when a man was pushing himself too hard. Once, when Werner nearly passed out from heat exhaustion, Tom had him in the shade with water before Klaus even realized something was wrong. "You fought in the war," Klaus said one evening, noticing the way Tom favored his left leg when he dismounted. Tom looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. France, 1918. Different war, same mud. He unsaddled his horse with practiced efficiency. Lost a lot of friends there. Good men. Germans mostly on the other side. I used to wonder what they were like. If they had families. If they liked music. If they were scared. He looked at Klaus directly. Now I know. They were just like us. The words settled into Klaus like stones into water, creating ripples he'd feel for days. By the second week, they were ready for their first real cattle drive. A smaller herd, only 500 head, moving them to fresh grazing land 15 miles north. Tom divided them into teams, mixing prisoners and ranch hands so they could learn from each other. Klaus found himself riding alongside Jesse, who talked constantly, a stream of observations and jokes and commentary that somehow made the long, dusty hours pass more quickly. That one there, Jesse said, pointing to a particularly stubborn cow who kept trying to break from the herd. She reminds me of my sister, always going her own way, no matter what anyone says. He grinned. But she always comes back when she's hungry. They rode through landscapes that seemed impossible. Narrow canyons where the rock walls echoed with hoofbeats. Open plains where the grass whispered secrets to the wind. Creek beds lined with cottonwoods, their leaves turning gold with the changing season. Klaus felt something shift inside him with each mile. The war seemed distant here, like something that had happened to someone else. The uniform he'd worn, the orders he'd followed, the certainties he'd believed. All of it felt thin and insubstantial compared to the solid reality of the horse beneath him and the land stretching endlessly ahead. On the third night of the drive, they made camp in a shallow valley protected from the wind. The cattle settled, their dark shapes dotting the hillside like boulders. The men gathered around the fire, exhausted and sun-scorched, while Rose's assistant, a young man named Carlos, served stew from a cast-iron pot that seemed bottomless. Someone produced a harmonica. Old Jack sang a ballad in a surprisingly clear tenor about a cowboy who died on the trail and was buried where the prairie met the sky. Friedrich leaned close to Klaus and whispered, "This is the freest I've felt since before the war. Strange, isn't it? Being prisoners but feeling free." Klaus understood exactly what he meant. There were no ranks here, no salutes, no propaganda, no speeches about destiny and duty. Just work, just land, just men trying to do a job well and take care of the animals in their charge. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Tom sat slightly apart from the group as he often did, his weathered face peaceful in the firelight. Klaus caught his eye, and Tom raised his coffee cup in a small salute. Klaus nodded back, a gesture of respect between men who'd found themselves on opposite sides of history, but the same side of something more fundamental. Above them, the stars emerged in their millions, so bright and numerous that Klaus felt dizzy looking at them. He'd never seen a sky like this. In Germany, there were always city lights or clouds or the smoke of industry. But here, the universe revealed itself completely, holding nothing back. "This is real," Otto said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. "This is what life is supposed to be." The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when the sky turned the color of old bruises. Tom stood at the corral fence, studying the horizon with an expression that made Klaus's stomach tighten. The cattle were restless, moving in anxious circles, their calls pitched higher than usual. The horses picked up on it too, ears swiveling, hooves stamping. "A storm is coming," Tom said quietly. "Big one. We need to move the herd to lower ground before it hits, or we'll lose them." He turned to face the assembled men. Prisoners and ranch hands together now, the distinctions blurred by weeks of shared work. "This isn't going to be like anything we've practiced. When cattle spook, they run. If they stampede in the wrong direction, they'll go over the mesa edge. We have to keep them contained, keep them calm, and get them into the canyon where they'll be protected." Klaus felt his mouth go dry. He'd heard stories about stampedes from Old Jack, walls of flesh and horn moving at terrifying speed, crushing anything in their path. Men had died that way, Jack said. Experienced men who'd made one small mistake. They rode out under a sky that seemed to press down on them. The air felt thick, electric, like something waiting to break. Tom positioned them in a wide arc around the herd. 2,000 head this time, a mix of longhorns and Herefords, their eyes white-rimmed with fear. Klaus found himself on the eastern flank, with Werner to his left and Jesse to his right. Penny sensed his nervousness and danced sideways, but Klaus forced himself to breathe slowly, to project calm he didn't entirely feel. "Talk to her," Jesse called over. "Let her know you're not scared." "But I am scared," Klaus admitted. Jesse laughed. "Then lie convincingly." The first raindrops fell like bullets, hard and cold. Within seconds, it was a deluge. Klaus could barely see 10 feet in front of him. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud he felt it in his chest, and the cattle surged forward in a panic-driven wave. This was it. This was the stampede. "Keep them turning." Tom's voice cut through the chaos. "Turn them into a mill. Don't let them run straight." Klaus drove Penny forward into the mass of moving bodies, his heart hammering. He could feel the heat of the cattle, smell their fierce sweat, hear the thunder of their hooves mixing with the thunder overhead. Jesse was beside him, rope swinging, voice raised in a high, carrying call that somehow pierced through the noise. Klaus found himself calling two nonsense syllables, anything to make sound, to be present, to convince these terrified animals that there was guidance in the chaos. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene in stark white. Friedrich on the far side, his horse rearing as a cow charged past. Otto somewhere in the middle, just a silhouette against the rain. Werner close by, leaning low in his saddle, driving 3 strays back toward the main group. And Tom, everywhere at once it seemed, directing traffic with shouts and gestures, reading the herd's movement like sheet music. Klaus lost track of time. Minutes or hours he couldn't tell. His world narrowed to the horse beneath him, the cattle around him, the rain hammering his shoulders. Penny knew what to do better than he did, cutting and turning with an instinct he could only try to follow. At some point his hat blew off, and rain streamed down his face, but he didn't stop. Gradually, impossibly, the herd began to circle. The stampede turned into a mill, cattle running in a wide loop rather than a straight line toward destruction. Tom had taught them about this, how to use the herd's momentum against itself, turning panic into pattern. It was working. Slowly, the circle tightened. The cattle began to calm, their run slowing to a trot, then to a nervous walk. By the time they got the herd into the canyon and the storm passed, Klaus was shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. He dismounted on unsteady legs and stood in the mud, letting the relief wash over him. Around him, the other men were doing the same, checking their horses, counting heads, making sure everyone had survived. "We lost 2, Tom said, his voice heavy. 2 cows went over the edge before we got them turned. But we saved the rest. All of you." He looked around at his crew, his eyes lingering on each prisoner in turn. "You did good. Real good. You didn't run. You didn't freeze. You did what needed to be done." Friedrich was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a branch had struck him. Otto's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold his reins. Werner looked like he'd aged 10 years. But they were grinning, all of them, with the wild relief of survival. That night, back at the ranch, Rosa made a feast, beef stew and cornbread and apple pie that tasted like heaven. The men sat together in the bunkhouse, too tired to sleep, replaying the day in fragments of memory. Jesse told the story 3 times, each version more dramatic than the last, until old Jack threw a boot at him and told him to shut up. Tom came by after midnight, making his rounds, checking on his crew. He stopped at Klaus's bunk. "You did something today I wasn't sure you could," he said quietly. "You trusted your horse and you trusted yourself. That's harder than it sounds." "I was terrified the entire time," Klaus admitted. "Good," Tom said. "Fear keeps you alert. It's panic that kills you. You stayed on the right side of that line." He paused, choosing his words. "I've worked with a lot of men, Klaus. Ranch hands, drifters, boys fresh off the farm. The good ones aren't the ones without fear. They're the ones who work through it. You're one of those. After Tom left, Klaus lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, standing in the desert in Tunisia, watching Allied tanks roll toward their position, knowing the war was over for him. He'd felt like a failure then, beaten, captured, worthless. But today he'd helped save 2,000 cattle from certain death. He'd ridden through a storm that could have killed him and come out the other side. He'd done something that mattered, something real, something that had nothing to do with politics or nations or the terrible machinery of war. The prisoner in him wanted to dismiss it as meaningless. He was still locked up, still guarded, still an enemy of the state he found himself in. But the man in him, the part that was learning to sit on a horse and read the land and work alongside men who'd been strangers a few weeks ago, that better. This was what Tom had meant about being tested. Not by cruelty or hardship, but by work itself. By the demands of the land and the animals and the weather. By being asked to be competent and brave and useful when everything in you wanted to run. Outside, Penny whinnied softly in the corral. Klaus smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow they'd do it all again, and he found himself looking forward to it. The incident happened in the town of Lordsburg itself, 3 weeks after the storm. Tom had needed supplies, and he'd brought Klaus and Friedrich with him, the guards accompanying them more out of protocol than necessity. By this point, the prisoners were trusted. They'd proven themselves on the ranch, and Tom had vouched for them personally. The general store smelled of coffee and leather and sawdust. Klaus stood near the window, watching the main street while Tom negotiated prices with the shopkeeper. A woman passed by, pushing a stroller, and smiled at him through the glass. He smiled back reflexively, then felt strange about it. When had he stopped feeling like a prisoner and started feeling like a person? "You boys from the camp?" The voice came from behind them. Klaus turned to see 3 men in the doorway. Ranchers by their dress, but younger than Tom, harder around the eyes. The one who'd spoken had a scar across his jaw and arms thick as fence posts. "They're with me," Tom said calmly, not looking up from his list. "They work the WWII. Work?" The scarred man stepped closer. "That's a funny word for what prisoners do. My brother's somewhere in the Pacific right now, fighting Japs. Maybe fighting Germans too, for all I know. And here these boys are, shopping like they're on vacation." The temperature in the store seemed to drop. The shopkeeper's hand moved slowly towards something beneath the counter. Klaus felt Friedrich tense beside him. They'd both been in enough fights to recognize the signs of violence gathering, the way pressure builds before an explosion. Tom finally looked up. His expression was mild, but something in his posture had changed. Weight settling, balance shifting. "These men work harder than most of my crew ever has," he said quietly. "They've earned their keep 10 times over. They're not on vacation. They're working for their country's enemies because they got captured in a war they probably didn't start and couldn't stop. That makes sense to you, Dalton?" Dalton, the scarred man, flushed red. "They're still Nazis." "I'm not," Klaus heard himself say. The words came out before he could stop them. "I was an engineer. I built bridges, not camps. I didn't vote for Hitler. I didn't want the war. I just—" He stopped, frustrated by the limits of his English. "I had no choice." "Everyone has choices," Dalton said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Do they?" Tom asked. "Have you ever been drafted, Dalton? Ever had someone point a gun at you and tell you to fight or die? Ever watched your country go crazy and found yourself swept along because the alternative was prison or execution?" He shook his head. "I fought in the last war. I killed Germans. Good men, probably. Men with families. Men who were just following orders, just trying to survive. And for what? So we could do it all again 20 years later." He picked up his supplies. "These men here, they're not asking for sympathy. They're just working. Same as you. Same as me. And if you've got a problem with that, you take it up with the army, not with me." The silence stretched. Then Dalton nodded slowly and stepped aside. "Your funeral, Tom," he said, but the heat had gone out of his voice. Outside, Klaus exhaled shakily. Thank you, he said to Tom. Tom loaded the truck bed with practiced efficiency. Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was true. He slammed the tailgate shut. But here's something you should know. Not everyone's going to see it the way I do. There are people in this town who have lost sons, brothers, and husbands. They look at you and they see the enemy, no matter what you say or do. That's not fair. But it's real. What do we do about it? Friedrich asked. You live your life anyway, Tom said. You work hard. You treat people decently. You prove every day that you're more than the uniform you used to wear. Some people will come around. Some won't. That's their problem, not yours. On the drive back to the ranch, Klaus stared out at the passing landscape and thought about identity. Who was he now? Not a German soldier, that man was gone, left in the desert sand of Africa. Not exactly a prisoner either, despite the barbed wire and the guards. He was becoming something else. Something that didn't have a name yet. That evening, Tom called a meeting in the main barn. The entire crew assembled, ranch hands and prisoners together, and Tom stood before them with a proposal. We've got a problem, he said. The Johnson Ranch lost half their crew to the draft, and they're underwater trying to get their herd ready for market. Old man Johnson's too proud to ask for help, but his daughter Sarah came by yesterday and told me they're in trouble. They need hands, fast, or they'll lose everything. He looked at Klaus and the other prisoners. I want to loan you out. A week, maybe 2. You'd be working a different ranch, different crew, but it's the same work you've been doing here. I'll square it with the camp commandant, but I need to know if you're willing. Klaus exchanged glances with Friedrich, Werner, and Otto. This felt like a test of a different kind. A chance to prove they could be trusted beyond the boundaries of the WWII. We'll go, Klaus said, speaking for all of them. The Johnson Ranch was smaller, scrappier, held together by determination and baling wire. Sarah Johnson was 35, widowed, running the place with 3 aging cowboys and her teenage son. She looked at the prisoners with open skepticism but nodded when Tom vouched for them. I don't care where you're from, she said bluntly. I need cattle moved, fences mended, and water troughs cleaned. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, Klaus said. They worked 14-hour days. The Johnson cattle were half wild, the land was rougher, and the equipment was older. But they worked. Otto, who'd grown up on a farm, diagnosed a problem with the well pump and fixed it with wire and intuition. Friedrich taught Sarah's son how to properly saddle a horse. Werner rebuilt a section of corral fence that had been falling apart for years. And Klaus found himself designing a better water distribution system, sketching plans in the dirt, then building it with scrap materials. By the end of the second week, Sarah Johnson invited them to eat dinner at her table. Not in the bunkhouse, at her table. It was a small thing, maybe, but it felt enormous. She served pot roast and potatoes and asked them about their families, their homes, their lives before the war. She listened to their broken English and responded with patience and something that might have been respected. The letter arrived in December, when the desert nights had turned cold and the morning frost painted the sagebrush silver. Klaus sat on his bunk reading it for the 3rd time, trying to make sense of the words. It was from the Red Cross, forwarded through official channels, and it contained news from home. His sister was alive. His parents were alive. Their house in Stuttgart had been bombed, but they'd survived. They were living with relatives in the countryside. They asked about him. They hoped he was well. They loved him. He should have felt joy, but what he felt was complicated. Relief, yes. Gratitude, but also a strange guilt. He'd been eating well, working in the sun, learning skills he'd never imagined. While his family had been hiding from bombs, he'd been riding horses across mesas that took his breath away. While Germany starved and burned, he'd been eating Rose's apple pie and laughing at Jesse's jokes. Good news? Friedrich asked, seeing the letter. Yes, Klaus said. And no. Tom found him later, standing by the corral, watching Penny nose through the feed. Heard you got word from home, Tom said. That's good. Is it? Klaus heard the bitterness in his own voice. What kind of son am I, Tom? My family is suffering, and I'm here, safe, comfortable. I should want to go back. I should be desperate to go home. Should you? Tom leaned against the fence. What's waiting for you there, Klaus? A country in ruins. Cities destroyed. The economy collapsed. Maybe prosecution for being on the wrong side. Maybe worse. He paused. Here you've got skills now. You've got work. You've got people who respect you. That doesn't make you a bad son. That makes you human. The war will end, Klaus said. Eventually. What happens to us then? I don't know, Tom admitted. But I'll tell you what I think. I think this country is going to need men who can work hard and build things. Men who understand what it means to start over. Men who've proven themselves. He looked at Klaus directly. There are programs, Klaus. Ways for prisoners to stay after the war. To immigrate. To become citizens. If that's something you wanted. The words hung in the cold air. Klaus felt something shift inside him. A door opening that he hadn't known was there. I'd have to leave my family, he said quietly. Maybe they'd come too, Tom suggested. After the war. After things settled. This is a big country. There's room. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Klaus thought about it constantly over the following weeks. He thought about it while moving cattle through winter pastures. He thought about it while mending tack in the barn. He thought about it while sitting around the evening fire, listening to old Jack's stories and Jesse's laughter. He was thinking about it when Sarah Johnson's son, Michael, asked him to teach him German, saying he wanted to learn languages. He was thinking about it when Werner announced he'd decided to stay in America after the war, no matter what it took. I've got nothing back there, Werner said. My wife is dead. My children are dead. My house is rubble. Here I've got work, purpose, friends. He looked around at the group. A new family, maybe? Christmas came. The ranch crew and the prisoners celebrated together. A strange blending of traditions. Rosa made tamales. Old Jack produced a bottle of whiskey. They sang carols in German and English, the melodies weaving together in the cold night air. Tom gave each prisoner a gift: new work gloves, hand-tooled by a leatherworker in town. It was a small thing, but Klaus held those gloves like they were made of gold. On New Year's Eve, Tom made an announcement. The war's turning, he said. Germany's losing ground. Italy's out. It's just a matter of time now. When it's over, this camp will close. Most of you will be shipped home. He paused. But I've been talking to some people. Some of you, those who want to, might be able to stay. Work programs. Immigration paths. It won't be easy. There'll be paperwork, interviews, approvals. But it's possible. Klaus felt his heart hammer. This was it. The choice. The moment that would define the rest of his life. That night, he wrote 2 letters. The first was to his family, telling them he loved them, that he was safe, that he would help them however he could. The second was an application, carefully filled out in his best English, requesting permission to remain in the United States after the war's conclusion. His reasons: specialized skills in engineering and livestock management, demonstrated good character, sponsorship by Tom Garrett of the WWII Ranch. He sealed both letters and sat holding them, feeling their weight. One represented the past, his history, his blood, his origins. The other represented the future, uncertain, difficult, but his own. In the morning, he would give them both to Tom to mail. But tonight, he sat under the vast New Mexico sky and let himself imagine. A small ranch of his own, maybe. Children who would grow up speaking English and riding horses. A life built not on the rubble of war, but on the solid foundation of work and land and chosen family. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was possible. Outside, Penny whinnied in the corral. Klaus smiled. I know, he said quietly to the night. I know. 5 months later, the war in Europe ended on a Tuesday afternoon in May. They heard it on the radio in the ranch house, Tom's old wireless crackling with news of German surrender. The prisoners gathered around it in silence, listening to descriptions of celebrations in London and Paris and New York. Klaus felt numb. Relief, yes. Sadness for the years wasted. Grief for the millions dead. but also something else. A strange, quiet hope. What now? Otto asked. Now we wait, Tom said. And we work. They worked. Through the summer heat, through the monsoon rains, through the slow machinery of military bureaucracy and immigration law. Klaus's application was approved in September. Werner followed in October. Friedrich decided to go home. His wife was alive, waiting for him, and he needed to go back. They said goodbye on a cool morning in November, embracing like brothers. Don't forget us, Friedrich said. Never, Klaus promised. 3 years later, Klaus Weber stood in front of the small ranch house he'd bought with a veteran's loan and money saved from 3 years of honest work. It was modest, 500 acres, a dozen cattle, a barn that needed repairs. But it was his. The deed had his name on it. Klaus Weber, American citizen. Tom rode up on the paint horse, older now, slower, but still steady. Place looks good, he said, surveying the property. You've done well, Klaus. I had a good teacher, Klaus replied. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee, watching the sun paint the mesas red and gold. In the corral, Penny. Tom had sold her to Klaus for $1, grazed peacefully. Somewhere in town, Werner was running a feed store. Sarah Johnson's son Michael was studying engineering at the State University, saying he wanted to build bridges like Klaus used to. Do you ever regret it? Tom asked. Staying? Klaus thought about his family in Germany. He sent money when he could and wrote letters every month. They were rebuilding slowly. His sister had married. His parents were managing. They understood his choice or said they did. Maybe someday they'd visit. Maybe someday he'd return for a visit. But this land, this life was home now. No regrets, Klaus said finally. I found something here I didn't know I was looking for. What's that? Freedom, Klaus said. Not from being a prisoner. Freedom to be just a man. No uniforms, no flags, no orders. Just work and land and choices that are mine to make. Tom nodded slowly. That's the thing about this country, he said. It doesn't care much about where you came from. Cares about what you do once you're here. You've done good, Klaus. Real good. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged. Those same impossible stars that Klaus had seen on his first cattle drive years ago. Back then, he'd been a prisoner marveling at the sky. Now he was a rancher, a citizen, a man who'd crossed more than an ocean. He'd crossed from one life into another. The next morning, Klaus would check his fences, feed his cattle, and maybe ride into town to help Werner with inventory. Simple work. Honest work. The kind of work that built something solid, something lasting. The kind of work that, unlike war, actually mattered. In the distance, a coyote called. Penny raised her head, ears forward, then returned to grazing. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, red and gold and eternal. Klaus thought about the young German officer he'd been, standing in the African desert, watching his world end. That man would never have imagined this. A ranch in New Mexico, a life built from scratch, a future that was his own. But then, that man had never seen a cowboy on a paint horse, sitting easy in the saddle, part of the land itself. Had never learned to read the weather in the shape of clouds or the language of cattle in their movements. Had never understood that freedom wasn't something governments gave you. It was something you built, one fence post at a time, one sunrise at a time, one choice at a time. Klaus stood, finishing his coffee. Tomorrow he'd start on the new barn. Next month he'd buy more cattle. Next year maybe he'd hire his first ranch hand. The future spread before him like the land itself. Open, challenging, full of possibility. He was home. Finally, truly home. Final scene. 10 years later, a young man arrived at the WWII ranch, stepping down from a bus in dusty clothes, speaking broken English with a thick accent. His name was Johann, and he was Friedrich's nephew, fresh from Germany, looking for work and a new start. Tom Garrett, grayer now, moving slower, but still steady, looked the young man over. Then he smiled. "Can you ride a horse?" he asked. "No, sir," Johann said. "But I can learn." "That's all we ask," Tom said. He turned and called across the yard. "Klaus, got someone here I want you to meet." Klaus walked over, his own hair touched with silver now, his hands scarred from years of honest work. He looked at the young German, saw the uncertainty and hope in his eyes, and remembered standing in exactly that same spot a decade ago, watching a cowboy on a paint horse and not believing what he was seeing. "Welcome," Klaus said in German, then repeated it in English. "We'll teach you everything you need to know. The work is hard, but it's good. This land," he gestured at the mesas and the endless sky, "it doesn't care where you're from. It just asks who you want to become." Johann nodded, something easing in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly. That evening, as the sun set over New Mexico and the cattle settled for the night, Klaus stood with Tom watching the new arrival learn to approach a horse, moving cautiously, respectfully, beginning the same journey they'd all made. "You think he'll stay?" Tom asked. "I think," Klaus said slowly, "that he'll find what he needs to find, same as we all did, same as anyone who's willing to do the work." The stars emerged, countless and brilliant, the same stars that had witnessed everything: wars and peace, endings and beginnings, prisoners becoming cowboys, enemies becoming friends, strangers becoming family. The land endured, the work continued, and men who'd been broken by war learned to rebuild themselves with rope and leather, sweat and skill, until the past became something you carried rather than something that carried you. Somewhere in the corral, Penny's daughter, a young paint mare Klaus had named Hope, whinnied softly. Tomorrow, Johann would learn to saddle her. The day after, he'd learn to ride. And somewhere down the line, years from now, he'd stand where Klaus stood now and watch another lost soul arrive. And he'd offer the same gift that had been offered to him. A chance. A choice. A beginning. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the smell of rain and dust and possibility. Klaus breathed it in, this air that had made him who he was, and smiled. He was home. They all were. And that was everything.